Okay, Tov, today's Daf Yomi is Bava Basra, Pei Gimel, Bava Basra 83, but Baruch Hashem, we're going to start on Pei Beis, Amma Beis, 10 lines from the bottom. So the Gemara is discussing the space between that if you had purchased in our Mishnah, it said if you purchased, how many trees do you have to purchase in order to get the space in between them? Is it 3? Is it 2? And so that's a dispute. But the Gemara on Pei Beis and Beis, 10 lines from the bottom, says, Kami Yehi Beinein. What's the amount of space between them for it to still be considered like it's a field of trees? Meaning, what's the distance between them? If it's too close, we're going to say it's a forest, and therefore they're going to be uprooted, and so therefore it's not a field of trees. We can't count all the trees. And if it's too distant, then we're going to say it's not a field of trees, they're just independent trees that you bought. So what's the space between them? So Rabbi Yosef says, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, they are ba'amos at shmona. It's from 4 to 8 amos. That's the space where if you have each tree is separate from each other tree from between 4 to 8 amos, and if you have the 3 trees, then you bought all the land around them. Whereas Rava says, in the name of Rav Nachman, in the name of Shmuel, mishmona at sheshes, from 8 until 16. So Abaye or Rabbi Yosef, so Abaye, a student of Rabbi Yosef, says to his Rebbe, he says to his Rebbe, don't argue with Rav Nachman. It's not masnisin kavase, because we actually have a Mishnah in Kalayim that rules like Rav Nachman that it's between 8 and 16 amos. How so? The Tanan, note as karma. We have this with respect to a vineyard. Now, if you have a grapevine, then we say you have to be the seeds to make koya karam, which we had in last week's parasha, just has to be a tefach away from a grapevine. But if it's a vineyard, then it has to be 4 amos away. So what's the definition of a vineyard? Hanotes karmo sheishes re'ama al sheishes re'ama muter lavizero hasham. So if the vineyard is 16 amos from 16 amos away from each other, basically a vineyard that's planted 6 by rows, and between each row there's a distance of 16 amos, then you're allowed to bring your seeds and plant it amongst them, because then we're going to say the grapevines don't combine to be considered a vineyard. And even though in that one row there's going to be a lot of grapevines, nevertheless, the Mesachas Koyim explains that it's only going to be considered a vineyard if there are 2 rows opposite each other and one at the end like a tail. And so therefore, since they're more than 16 amos apart, we're not going to view it as a vineyard. But if there's less than 16 amos, then you're not allowed to plant between them, because it's going to be considered as a vineyard. And so we see from here that the gap for it to be one vineyard is 16 amos and not 8 amos. So therefore, this is going to be exactly like Rav Nachman. So I'm Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says, Ma'isa b'tzalmon be'echad. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to bring a proof for the Tanna Kama's position from the Tzalmon, from the incident in Tzalmon. Shenotas karmo sheishes re'al sheishes re'ama. He planted his vineyard 16 amos apart from each other. And then what he would do was hayahofech sa'ar shtei shuros l'tzad echad v'zoreya sanir, and he would push the branches in the opposite direction, so it would not make it less than 16 amos, and then he would be able to plow in between them. And so this proves that it is 16 amos. Rabbi Yehuda and Tanna Kama don't seem to be arguing. The next year he would push the branches towards where he had planted the seeds the previous year, and then he would basically plant externally. And so therefore, so we see from here, the sages allowed it. So we see from here that the law is like Rav Nachman quoted in the name of Shmuel, that it's 16 amos. So Rav Yosef responded to his student Abaye, Amrulay, Ana lo yadana. He says, I don't know how to explain that Mishnah, Ela uvda hava, but I can tell you that there was an incident. Bidura de Reusa, or on top of Pei Gimel Amud Aleph, there was an incident amongst the shepherds of Reusa. We already had these shepherds once in our track, or twice, that they were the shepherds which they brought back the goats. Remember we were talking about that? But there's a place of Duru de Reusa, a city of shepherds. Now, one person sold to his friend 3 trees, and there was not a gap of 8 amos between them. And Rabbi Yehuda, I'm reading from the Rashbam, Rabbi Yehuda said to the sellers, go give the purchaser the land there. And even though there was only between them a space of Kamul, Bakar, Vakalov, meaning to say that there wasn't 8 amos between them. There was less than that. And Rabbi Yehuda said to give it to them. So let's leave the Gemara inside. But Dura Durus of also coming to Rabbi Yehuda of Amar Zil have like Kamul, Bakar, Vakalov. So give them this space, even though there's not 8 amos. We didn't know what it was, the space that he calls Kamul Bakar Vakalov, the amount that a plow and the utensils can go through. We didn't know how much it was. Given the Shemata Lahadatanam, but then once we heard this Mishnah, Lo Yita Adam Ilan Samach Asada Chaverolam Kim Hirchak Mimenu Dawad Amos. We saw another Mishnah which said that a person is not allowed. We had this earlier in our tractate in Chavav Amud Aleph, that a person is not allowed to plant his seeds or his tree next to the field of his friend unless he put a gap of 4 amos. And what's the reason? The reason is because he needs to bring his stuff there to pick from his tree, and so therefore he has to have a gap of 4 amos. And the reason why we said the 4 amos that he has to leave a gap for his tree is kidei avodas hakerem, because the amount that the person is entitled to is he's allowed to go 4 amos beyond his land to bring his plow there to stand there and work the land. So Amina Shema Mina Kamul Bakar Vakalov Dawad Amos. So I said, oh, it's 4 amos. That's the gap. So we see from here that in this case where there was an 8 amos between them, Rabbi Yehuda said to the seller, you have to give to him the ground of 4 amos. We see from here that the law is 4 to 8 amos, and that's what Rav Yosef had cited in the name of Shmuel, not 8 to 16 amos like Rav Nachman had cited in the name of Shmuel. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. Why is Rav Yosef citing the incident from the Dura de Reusa, from the shepherds of Reusa? Rav Yosef Milotanan. Rav Yosef had his own Mishnah he could have cited from the Mishnah in Klaim, where Rabbi Meir Shimon said, Hanotes Karmo Shmona Amos al Shmona Mutter, that Mutter Havizerasham, that if you planted your vineyard 8 rows by 8 rows, that means it's a gap of 8 amos, then you're allowed to bring your seed to there. So we see from there that 8 amos is the gap and not 16 amos. So why is he citing the Mishnah? Why is he citing the Maisa of the Dura Usa when he could have just cited the Mishnah in Klaim? So the Gemara says an astonishing idea. Even though we have explicit Mishnah, it's preferable to cite the Maisa, the incident that happened. The story of how the people paskin is going to be preferred to the actual halacha from the Mishnah, because the story shows the Masorah, it shows how they were living it. Now, Bishlam Rav Yosef, Aliba de Rabbi Shimon, Shaminole Mifuzarin, Vishaminole Ritzufin. So he says, okay, I understand Rav Yosef, according to the Tana of Rabbi Shimon, we see how much the gap can be for it, and it still be considered to be part of one field that is 8 amos. Vishaminole Ritzufin, and we saw how much the minimum gap is, and it's not going to be considered a forest. That's 4 amos. Mefuzarin hada amrin. The mefuzarin is where Rabbi Shimon said 8 amos for the vineyard. V'ritzufin d'tanan. How do we know the ritzufin that has to be 4 amos, a minimum, and less than that? We view it as the trees are too close together. D'tanan kerem anatua pachos midal amos eno kerem. Rabbi Shimon. If there's a vineyard that's less than 4 amos planted, it's not a vineyard. So I'm say it's still a vineyard, and we view by a vineyard, we're going to be strict, and we'll view the internal vines as though they're not there. But according to Rav Nachman, according to the Rabbanan, Rav Nachman, it says 8 to 16 amos. Well, Mefuzarin Shaminole, we know that it's Mefuzarin because he says the 16 amos by the vineyard that we cited in the Mishnah and Klaim at the bottom of Pei Beis and Beis. But how do we know that the minimum gap that for it to be a field of trees is 8 amos between each tree? So Gemara says Svaraho. No, it's just logical. Middle Rabbi Shimon Palga, and the fact that Rabbi Shimon views it as from the fact that Rabbi Shimon has 8 amos and 4 amos, he cuts it in half. Therefore, Rabbanan Nami Paga will assume the Rabbanan's position of the minimum is also going to be half of the maximum, and therefore it's going to be 16 and 8. So it says Amarava Elchasame Arba Amos Vad Sheish Esrei. Now, halacha is actually not like this position of 8 and 16, but the halacha is 4 and 16. And the Rashbam explains, because we actually don't have an explicit shita that the Rabbanan is half. We just, the only shita we know that's about the minimum is Rabbi Shimon's shita of 4. So we don't know that anybody argues with that. And so therefore, we're going to paskin like the Rabbanan 16. But the Rabbanan don't say anything about the minimum part. So we'll assume it's like Rabbi Shimon who says it's 4. So that's why Rabbi says, Hilchasa, me arba amos had sheshes rein. Tanya Kavase, the Rava, Kame, we have a brayso that says this, Kame Mikuravan, arba amos. They can be 4 amos together, and then we'll say that they'll get the land in between. The Kamayu Meruchak, and how distant can they be? Sheshes rein, 16 amos. And if you've done this, Arezeh Kanakarka Vesailona Shabanan. If it's this gap, then you've acquired all the land and the trees between them. Therefore, for that reason, if the tree dried up or it was cut down, he's going to get the land and he can replant it. If it's less than this gap, or more than that, or if he didn't buy them at the same time, he hasn't bought the real estate or the trees between them. So therefore, if the tree dries up or if it gets cut off, he's not entitled to the real estate. He can't replant it. So by Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to ask a question. Rabbi Yirmiyah, we know already asked a lot of he's one throughout the Shash who asks these types of questions. When you measure these 4 amos and these 8 amos and these 16 amos, makam katsara moded or makam rachav moded, which part of the tree trunk are you measuring from? This is the big Rabbi Yirmiyah. He's always measuring when he's asking these questions. You measure it from the bottom where it's wider or from the narrower part at the top. Amoy Rav Gavia, mi beikatzel Rav Ashi Tashma. I'll give you an answer. The Tanan, your kivua shebegefen, eina moded el miikar sheni. So he says, if let's say you have a young grapevine that you're attaching to an older grapevine, so you basically have 2 grapevines mixed together. How do you measure it? You're going to measure it from the second part of it, the Me'ikar Sheni. Rashbam says the Pekaka Sheni, the second basically little ball on it. So that's where you measure it from. So then we have the next question. By Rabbi Yirmiyah Machar, another question from Rabbi Yirmiyah. But Machar lo Shlosha Bada Yilan Mao. So let's say you sold him 1 tree, but this tree has 3 basically branches or shoots that are distanced from each other from Daled Amos. And like we said before, the ground is covering it up. So it looks like the time that you sell it was 3 trees. Do we go after the main tree? And so therefore, there's only 1 tree and he doesn't get the real estate. Or perhaps we say, since each one took root in the ground, he's acquired the ground, even though they're connected underneath the ground. So that's what the way the Rashbam gives another answer, but this is the one that he prefers. So what's the answer there? So Amalu Rav Gavia mi Bei Kasil Rav Ashi Tashma Detzad Amavrach Gimel Gefanim Vikareyan. So we're going to answer this question based upon the Mishnah in Mesechas Koyim. Amavrach Shlosha Gefanim. If a person bends 3 grapevines toward the ground and he covers up the middle one with earth so that it could root, and now it looks like it's 6 grapevines vikareyan near in, and they took root in the ground. Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Tzadok Omer, Yesh b'nei me'arba amos, Shimon amos would start from the Lavei mitzdarfen. So we see from here that they can combine. Once you put them in the ground, we're going to view it as separate trees. So even though even though at their source there are 3 grapevines, nevertheless, since after they root it looks like there's 6, it's going to be like considered like a vineyard. And so the same thing with the 3 by a tree, that you will have acquired the real estate amongst them. This is the reason why the Gemara said earlier that if you bought the trees and then it started sprouting into, you bought a tree and then it started getting these shoots, the purchaser has to cut them down so it doesn't look like he's, so it doesn't lead to fraud against the seller. So he sold 2 trees. He sold 2 trees in the field, but 1 on the border. So the one on the border is not typically considered part of a field of trees. So what will be the one in this case? Or or he sold him 2 trees in his field and 1 in his friend's field. And meaning to say, can you combine them? Mai. So the Gemara says, Teiko. Under these circumstances, the answer is Teiko, meaning to say in the last case where he says he bought 2 in his field and 1 in his friend's field, the additional tree that was standing in his friend's field, the seller had purchased it with the land, and now he sold to the purchaser this tree with 2 trees that were at the edge of his field. So that's going to be the question, my Teiko. Do we say that since they're in 2 separate fields, they're not going to be combined, or do we say, listen, he's selling the 3 trees? So the Gemara now says on the top of Pegim on the base by Rav Ashi, Bor Maoshatapsik. Let's say you have this pit in the ground between the 3 trees. Is that interrupted, or do you still get the ground? Ambasamayim, or let's say you have a stream of water above ground. Maoshatapsik. Well, that interrupted. Rishus Harabim. Let's say you have the public domain in between. Mao, does that interrupted? Richva the Dikla Mao. Let's say you have a lot of palm trees bunched together. Does it look like a barrier, and therefore you don't get the land? So in all these cases, it says take it. By me Hillel mi Rebbe. So Hillel asked the question from Rebbe. So Hillel asked the Rebbe this following question. Allah aras b'nei. Let's say there's a cedar tree that went up amongst the 3 trees. Does that act as a barrier, and you don't get the land? Allah b'rashuta didei. The Gemara says the question, what do you mean? Oh, if he bought the trees and then the cedar grew, that's not a problem. He already bought it. It's in his domain. No, let's say there was a cedar tree amongst them. What would be the law? He says, no, the cedar tree does not act as a barrier. He's acquired it. He's acquired the land, and he's also got the cedar tree. So the Gemara now asks the next question. What's the order in which these trees are standing? How are these trees standing? So the Gemara says, Rav Amar Kashura, Shmuel Amar Kachatsuva. Rav says like a straight line, and that's how you're going to get the land in between, even if it's like a straight line. And Shmuel says Kachatsuva. If you look at it, Rashram has a diagram. It's basically looks like the vowel, the segel, like the 3 dots, or what we might call a tripod or a triangle. So that's where we say that you've acquired the land in between, because if he sold you those 3 trees, he's not going to be able to plant around there. But the rows is the bigger chiddush. So that's why the Gemara says, Man Amar Kashur, Rav, who says a straight line, Kolshken Chatzuva. For sure, if it's like this triangle, for sure he bought the land in between. Amandam Chatzuva, and Shmuel says like a triangle, but a straight line, he has not bought the land. My time Misham the Mizdara Bain Tile, because this person who sold it them can plant in between the trees, and so therefore he didn't sell him the ground. So the Gemara says El Meato, if that's the case, Zabalai Tlas Higi Ramaisa, Tlam Mizdara Binayo, Chinami, Hachinami Dieshlo Karka. But let's say he sold him 3 thorn bushes. You can't plant amongst them. Would you say that he's going to get the real estate in that case? I'm like, Hanechu Chashivi. Hana Chashivi. So the Gemara says, the Gemara answers the Funa, says, no, these bushes, don't say but the land in between. These thorn bushes are not important. They're distinguished, unlike the trees, which are distinguishable and recognizable and of value. So therefore, that's a distinction. So now we're up to the next Mishnah. Mocha rosh behemagasa. Let's say somebody says, I'm selling you the head of an animal, a large animal. Well, mocha esaraglayim, he has not sold the legs. Mocha esaraglayim. If he sold the legs of the animal, then he's not included in the sale. Well, mocha esarosh. He's not included the head. Mocha esakana. Let's say he sold the lungs. So, well, mocha esakaved. He has not sold the liver. Machar Sekaved, he has sold the liver, well, Machar Sekane is not sold the lungs. Aval Badka, Aval Badaka, but by a small animal, since the small animal, Machar Sarosh, Machar Saraglaim, if he said he's selling the head, then in that case, we include the legs. Machar Saraglaim, if he sold the legs, well, Machar Sarosh, he does not include the head. Machar Sekana, if he sold the lungs, Machar Sekaved, he sold the liver. Machar Sekaved, if he sold the liver, or Machar Sekana, he's not sold the lungs. Where it says, Arba Midos ben Mochrin, there are four, the Mishnah says, there are four categories with respect to a sale. Machar Lochitin Yafos, let's say he says, I'm going to sell you good wheat. Basically, he says, I'm going to sell you grade A wheat. That's what the seller says to the purchaser. V'nimtzu rows, and then we discover actually that it's not good wheat, it's bad wheat. Only the purchaser can go back and not the sale. And Rashbam says, in this case, we're going to say that it is going to be considered not like a mekach tos. If it would be a mistaken sale, both of them could go back, because in this case, he stipulated he's going to sell the wheat, and indeed he did sell him wheat. And even though they're discovered to be bad, it's only going to be considered like a case of onah, price fraud, and therefore he'd have to return the 1/6. But it's not enough to cancel the sale. And the Rashbam says the chiddush is, if even after he sold it, the price of wheat went way up, and the seller wants to cancel the sale, nevertheless, since at the time of the sale, he wasn't being defrauded, he can't cancel the sale. So that's the first case. If he sold him wheat, and then the discovery was bad, then only the purchaser could go back. But if he sold him bad wheat, rose, then then only the seller could go back. Rose v'nimtos rose. Let's say he sold him bad wheat, turned out to be bad, or yafos v'nimtos yafos, then obviously, or good wheat turned out to be good, then neither one can go back on it, and that's obvious. That case is obvious. And the Rashbam explains, isn't this obvious? Obviously, there was a good sale. You can't go back on it. So the Rashbam says, well, in the case of the bad wheat, maybe the purchaser is saying, I didn't want bad wheat. The only reason why I said bad wheat, not because I wanted it, but that's generally speaking, for the people purchasing, is to say, typically speaking, they get bad wheat. And also by good wheat. Okay, fine. So he has to explain why this is a chiddush. Now we go on to the last case of the Mishnah is shechamtis v'nimtis levana. Let's say he sold the red wheat, turns out to be white. Or levana v'nimtis shechamtis, he says, I want white wheat, and turns out he got the red wheat. Eitim shel zayis v'nimtu shel shekma. He says, I want to buy. He says, I'm going to sell you olive wood. It turns out to be sycamore, shel shekma v'nimtu shel zayis, or sycamore, and turns out to be however, yayin v'nim tzachom. It says, sell me wine, and in the end he sold him vinegar, or vice versa. So then we're going to say, under those circumstances, both could go back because they're two different products, and so therefore it's a mekach tos, it's a mistaken sale, and so therefore both of them are able to go back. Okay, so that's today's Daf Yomi. We'll stop here. God willing, we'll pick this up. We'll review it again at 8 a.m. We'll pick it up again tonight. A big shkoyach. I can tell you.